Today's story is titled, It Was Yesterday Just for Real Family. My parents smirked when I asked about my sister's wedding. Have you ever discovered that the people you loved most had already erased you from their lives before you even knew it? I believed my family was unbreakable. I believed no matter how difficult life became, my parents and my sister would always stand beside me. Then I made one simple phone call to ask when my little sister was getting married. Instead of an invitation, I heard my mother's cold laughter before she said the words that shattered everything I thought I knew. It was yesterday, only for real family. In a single moment, years of sacrifice, loyalty, and unconditional love were wiped away as if I had never existed. But what hurt even more was discovering that the wedding was only the beginning of a far darker betrayal, one that reached into my father's legacy, my family's home, and secrets buried for years. They believed they had broken me. They believed I would stay silent, keep giving, and disappear without a fight. They had no idea they had just awakened the one person capable of destroying every lie they had built together. Before this story ends, hidden documents will surface, shocking truths will come to light, trusted faces will reveal their true nature, and those who mocked me will find themselves begging for the mercy they never showed me. If you have ever been betrayed, underestimated, or treated as though your kindness made you weak, stay with me until the very last minute. I promise this journey will deliver twists you will never see coming, emotional moments that will leave you speechless, and a final reckoning so satisfying that every second of waiting will be worth it. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I have spent my career teaching English at a public high school, believing that words matter because they reveal who people truly are. For most of my life, I also believed that family was the one story that could never be rewritten, no matter how painful the chapters became. I was wrong. After that phone call, silence settled over my house like a heavy winter blanket. I stood in my kitchen for what felt like hours, staring through the window without really seeing the garden I had spent years tending. The flowers swayed gently in the spring breeze, birds hopped across the fence, and the world carried on as though nothing had happened. But inside me, something had broken beyond repair. Eventually, I forced myself upstairs. My bedroom door creaked open, revealing everything I had prepared for a celebration that had already happened without me. Hanging neatly inside my closet was a lavender dress. I had spent weeks choosing it because Emily once told me lavender was her favorite color. She had laughed years earlier and said, "When I get married someday, I want my sister standing beside me looking beautiful." I remembered those words so clearly that they almost sounded real again. Looking at the dress now felt like reading a promise someone else had written before deciding to tear it apart. Below the dress rested a pair of elegant shoes I had bought during a weekend shopping trip months earlier. I remembered the woman at the boutique smiling as she wrapped them in tissue paper. She had asked whether I was attending something special. I proudly told her my little sister was getting married. She smiled warmly and said Emily was lucky to have someone who loved her so much. At the time, I had smiled back without hesitation. Now that memory stung almost as much as my mother's voice on the phone. On the floor beside the shoes sat a silver gift box, tied with a ribbon I had carefully straightened more than once. I carried it to my bed and slowly untied the bow. Inside was the photo album I had spent weeks creating by hand. Every page held a piece of our childhood together. There was Emily on her first bicycle, while I ran behind her with one hand gripping the seat. There we were wearing matching dresses at Easter, laughing with frosting smeared across our faces after baking cookies with our grandmother. Another photograph showed her asleep against my shoulder during a long family road trip, while I smiled at the camera, proud to be the protective older sister. I turned each page slowly, feeling as though every photograph belonged to strangers instead of us. I had planned to give Emily this album on her wedding morning. I imagined watching her cry as she remembered everything we had survived together. Instead, I sat alone on my bed, holding a gift no one would ever open. For a few moments, I allowed myself to imagine what should have happened. I pictured arriving at the church early, helping Emily adjust her veil while we laughed through nervous tears. I imagined my parents smiling proudly as both daughters stood together for family photographs. I imagined raising a glass during the reception and telling everyone how proud I was of the woman my little sister had become. Then reality crashed back without mercy. There had been no invitation, no phone call, no explanation, only the words that continued echoing through my mind. Only for real family. I gently closed the album and placed it back inside its box. Looking into the mirror across the room, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My eyes looked exhausted, not from crying, but from trying to understand something that refused to make sense. Families argued. They disappointed one another. They even drifted apart. But deliberately planning an entire wedding while making sure one daughter never even knew the date, that wasn't forgetfulness. That was a choice. That evening, I made the mistake of opening social media. Photographs flooded my screen almost immediately. Emily stood beneath a canopy of white flowers, glowing with happiness beside David. My parents stood proudly between them, smiling wider than I had seen in years. Cousins, aunts, uncles, neighbors, and old family friends all filled the church pews and reception hall. Every image overflowed with warmth, celebration, and belonging. Except, there was no trace of me. I searched every group photograph, every candid picture, every table at the reception. It was as though I had vanished from our family long before the wedding day ever arrived. Then I found a guest's video from the reception. My mother stood at the front of the ballroom holding a microphone. Everyone grew quiet as she smiled proudly around the room. "Today," she announced, lifting her glass, "everyone who truly belongs to this family is here together." The guests applauded. Some even wiped away tears. I couldn't breathe. She hadn't simply excluded me. She had publicly declared that I no longer belonged. Messages soon began appearing beneath the wedding photos. "Weren't you supposed to be there? I thought you and Emily were close. Did you miss the ceremony?" I typed the truth several times. I wasn't invited. They didn't want me there. Each time, I erased the words before pressing send. I couldn't bear the thought of strangers pitying me, even if they deserved to know what had happened. I closed my laptop and sat in complete silence. For the first time in my life, I understood that being forgotten and being erased were two very different things. Forgetting is an accident. Erasing someone takes planning. It takes intention. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the heartbreak and confusion, a quiet question began growing louder. If my own family could erase me so completely from one of the most important days of their lives, what else had they hidden from me all these years? That question refused to leave me. It followed me through the next morning as I prepared lesson plans for my students, through every class I taught, and all the way home. I smiled when my students asked questions about literature, graded essays with the same patience I always had, and thanked colleagues who wished me a pleasant afternoon. On the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, however, I had begun examining my entire life through a different lens, searching for moments I had once called love but now wondered might have been exploitation. As I unlocked my front door that evening, my eyes drifted toward an old jewelry box sitting on my dresser. It had been years since I had opened it. Most of the pieces inside were inexpensive gifts from birthdays and Christmas mornings, but there was one empty velvet slot that had never stopped catching my attention. It was where my engagement ring had once rested. Seeing that empty space pulled me backward through time. There had been a season when my life looked very different. I was engaged to a kind man who dreamed of traveling with me after I completed graduate school overseas. We spent countless evenings making plans for the future, talking about little apartments, bookstores we wanted to visit, and countries we hoped to explore together. I believed that chapter of my life had already been written. Then Emily's acceptance letter arrived. She had been admitted to one of the best universities in the state, but the tuition was far beyond what my parents could afford. I still remembered sitting around the dining room table as everyone tried to hide their panic. Emily fought back tears while my mother quietly repeated that perhaps college would have to wait another year. My father stared silently at the bills spread across the table, looking older than I had ever seen him. No one asked me to help. No one expected me to solve the problem. I simply couldn't stand watching my little sister's dream disappear. A week later, I walked into a jeweler's office, carrying the engagement ring that had once symbolized my own future. The man behind the counter examined it carefully before naming a price. I never negotiated. I accepted the first offer, because every hour mattered. By the afternoon, the money had been transferred toward Emily's tuition. I never told her where it came from. I never told my fiancé the whole truth either. I simply said my family needed me. At first he tried to understand, but months turned into years. Every time we planned our wedding, another family emergency appeared. Another bill. Another sacrifice. Eventually, he looked at me with quiet disappointment and asked a question I never forgot. When will your life finally become your own? I didn't have an answer. Eventually, he stopped asking. Looking back, I couldn't blame him. I had chosen my family every single time. I convinced myself there would be another opportunity for happiness once everyone else was secure. After Emily started college, the sacrifices continued. During the day, I taught school. In the evenings, I tutored struggling students or worked weekends at the public library whenever they needed extra staff. Summers became opportunities to earn additional income instead of taking vacations. Every extra dollar seemed to find its way toward my parents' household. The roof needed repairs. Emily needed textbooks. The mortgage payment was late. The furnace stopped working. There was always something. Whenever my mother called, I never asked many questions. If she said they needed help, I found a way. Some months I skipped buying new clothes. Other months I postponed medical appointments or canceled plans with friends because overtime paid better than weekends away. It never felt like a burden because I believed we were carrying the weight together. I thought families worked that way. One rainy Saturday afternoon, several days after discovering I had been excluded from the wedding, I opened my laptop hoping to distract myself with work. Instead, the wedding photographs appeared again across nearly every social media page I visited. I almost closed the computer. Instead, I kept scrolling. There was Emily dancing with David beneath sparkling lights. There were my parents laughing with relatives I hadn't seen in years. Every photograph showed people celebrating the beginning of a beautiful new life. Then one picture made my breath stop. David was gently kissing Emily's hand as she smiled at him. The camera had captured the ring perfectly. I leaned closer to the screen. The elegant oval diamond, the narrow platinum band, even the tiny scratch near one side where I had accidentally brushed it against a brick wall years earlier while helping my father repair the garden fence. It was my ring. There was absolutely no doubt. The room seemed to spin around me as memories collided with the present. I remembered sliding that ring across the jeweler's glass counter, believing I was trading one dream for another person's future. I remembered telling myself love could wait, because family came first. Now, that same ring glittered proudly on Emily's finger. For several long minutes, I simply stared at the photograph. I wasn't angry that David had purchased a second-hand ring. He probably never knew its history. What shattered me was realizing that Emily did. She knew exactly where that ring had come from. She knew what I had sacrificed. She knew whose future had paid for hers. Yet she had accepted it without saying a single word, without calling me, without thanking me, without even inviting me to witness the moment it became part of her new life. I closed the laptop slowly and rested both hands on the kitchen table to steady myself. For years, I had believed sacrifices disappeared once they were made. I thought love meant giving without expecting anything in return. But sitting there alone, I finally understood something painful. Real love may not demand repayment. It should never require erasure. My family hadn't simply forgotten what I had done for them. They had built their happiness on those sacrifices while pretending they had never existed. Every late night at work, every postponed dream, every lonely holiday, every dollar I had sent, they had accepted it all, as though it belonged to them from the beginning. A strange calm settled over me. Not peace. Something colder. For the first time since that devastating phone call, I wasn't crying. I wasn't asking why. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. If they could take the most meaningful symbol of my past and quietly weave it into their future without a trace of guilt? What else had they taken from me while I was too busy loving them to notice? That question stayed with me for days, quietly reshaping every memory I had once treasured. Instead of searching for reasons behind my family's cruelty, I began searching for facts. Feelings could be denied, excuses could be invented, but facts had a way of standing long after every lie had collapsed. A few afternoons later, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, Nora stood there holding a loaf of homemade banana bread wrapped in a kitchen towel. We had been friends since high school, the kind of friends who could sit together in silence without feeling uncomfortable. She looked at me for only a second before wrapping me in a hug. "You look exhausted," she said softly. "I've been better." We settled into the kitchen with coffee, talking about ordinary things at first. My students, her grandchildren, the unpredictable spring weather. But I could tell she hadn't come simply to deliver fresh bread. She kept stirring her coffee long after the sugar had dissolved. Finally, she sighed. "Sarah, there's something I heard at the wedding." Every muscle in my body tightened. "I wasn't sure whether to tell you." "Please." Nora lowered her voice even though we were alone. "I overheard your mother talking to one of David's relatives. They were discussing wedding gifts." I nodded, waiting. Someone joked that newlyweds always need help buying their first home. She looked directly into my eyes. "Your mother smiled and said they wouldn't need to worry because the family house was already being prepared for Emily and David." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. "The family house?" I finally whispered. Nora nodded. She said it confidently, not like it was an idea, like everything had already been arranged. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. That house wasn't simply another piece of property. It was the place where my father taught me to ride a bicycle, the place where every birthday candle had been blown out, the place where every Christmas morning began before sunrise. More importantly, it was the house I had fought to save. Years earlier, when my parents received the foreclosure notice, panic spread through the family. My father's small business had struggled, medical bills had accumulated, and the bank was ready to reclaim everything. I still remembered sitting beside my father after everyone else had gone to bed. He looked at the mortgage statement for a long time, before quietly saying, "This home has protected our family for decades." Then he looked at me. "One day it'll protect you too." Those words had stayed with me ever since. Within weeks, I had emptied my savings, sold my reliable little car, and accepted every extra tutoring opportunity I could find. It took months of relentless work, but eventually I walked into the bank carrying enough money to stop the foreclosure. My father cried that day. It was the only time I had ever seen tears in his eyes. Now Nora was telling me that same house had apparently become Emily's wedding gift, without anyone asking me, without anyone informing me, without anyone acknowledging where the money had come from. "I need to know whether it's true," I said quietly. Nora reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I hoped I misunderstood. So did I. But deep inside, I already knew this wasn't another misunderstanding. Too many pieces were beginning to fit together. The secret wedding, the deliberate exclusion, the strange confidence my mother had displayed. None of it felt random anymore. The following morning, I took a personal day from school for the first time in years. Instead of driving toward campus, I headed downtown to the county records office. The old brick building looked exactly as I remembered from childhood, when my father occasionally brought me along while handling paperwork. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as clerks sorted stacks of documents with practiced efficiency. I approached the reception desk and requested the property records for my parents' address. The young clerk asked me to wait. Those 15 minutes felt longer than the entire drive. Eventually, he returned carrying a worn manila folder. I thanked him and carried it to a nearby table. As soon as I opened it, my heartbeat accelerated. There it was. A property transfer dated 6 months earlier. The new owner listed on the document was Emily. I blinked several times, convinced I had misread the page. Then my eyes dropped lower. A signature appeared where my approval should have been. My name, Sarah Mitchell. But it wasn't mine. At first glance, it looked convincing. The letters were shaped correctly. The spacing looked similar. Anyone unfamiliar with my handwriting would probably accept it without hesitation. I wouldn't. Years of grading handwritten essays had made me unusually attentive to details. The pressure points were wrong. The angle of the final letter was different. Even the rhythm of the signature felt unnatural. Someone had practiced writing my name. Someone had become very good at it. But it wasn't me. I carried the document back to the reception desk. I need to speak with the notary who approved this transfer. The clerk disappeared into a nearby office. Moments later, a woman stepped into the hallway. The instant I saw her, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Mrs. Carlyle. She had attended countless neighborhood cookouts with my parents. She had hugged Emily at graduation. She knew our family. She certainly knew me. I placed the document between us. I never signed this. She barely glanced at the page. If your signature is there, then it must have been handled properly. You know that's not true. Her expression remained carefully controlled, but something flickered in her eyes before disappearing again. I notarize many documents every week. This one transferred my father's house. I'm afraid I can't discuss confidential matters. She wasn't answering my questions. She was avoiding them. There is a difference. I looked directly at her. You recognize me. Silence. You know I wasn't sitting in front of you when this document was signed. Another pause. Finally, she adjusted the papers in her hands. If you have legal concerns, you should speak with an attorney. That was all she said. No denial. No explanation. Just an invitation to leave. I walked out carrying copies of every document I was legally allowed to obtain. The afternoon air felt strangely colder than when I had arrived. As I crossed the parking lot toward my car, an uncomfortable feeling settled over me. Someone was watching. I glanced around casually. Across the street, a dark sedan sat parked with its engine running. Its windows were too heavily tinted to see inside. I unlocked my car without looking back again. The moment I pulled away from the curb, the sedan eased into traffic several vehicles behind me. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. After several blocks, it turned onto another street and disappeared. Even so, the uneasy feeling remained. By the time I reached home, I spread every copied document across my dining room table. The forged signature stared back at me under the afternoon sunlight. The wedding had never been the true beginning of this story. It had merely been the moment I finally noticed that someone had been quietly rewriting my life for a very long time. The realization settled over me with a quiet certainty I could no longer ignore. The forged documents spread across my dining table weren't isolated acts of deception. They were pieces of a carefully constructed plan. Every signature, every hidden transfer, every omission pointed to something far larger than I had wanted to believe. But before I rushed into a confrontation, I needed to know one thing. How far were they willing to go? The answer came sooner than I expected. 3 evenings later, my mother called. Her voice sounded unusually pleasant, almost cheerful. "We're having everyone over for dinner tomorrow," she said. "Emily and David wanted to share some wedding photos. We'd like you to come." For a brief second, I wondered whether guilt had finally reached them. Perhaps someone had questioned why I wasn't at the wedding. Maybe they wanted to apologize. Then I remembered the forged deed sitting inside my desk drawer. No, I reminded myself silently. People who feel guilty don't forge signatures. "I'll be there," I replied calmly. The next evening, I drove to the house where I had spent nearly my entire childhood. The familiar porch looked exactly the same. The white rocking chair my father used every summer still sat in its usual corner. The maple tree we planted together continued casting long shadows across the front yard. Everything looked familiar. Nothing felt like home. When my mother opened the door, she greeted me with a quick smile that never quite reached her eyes. "There you are." She hugged me briefly before turning toward the kitchen. Inside, the house buzzed with conversation. Emily laughed loudly at something David had just said. My father wasn't there to fill the room with his quiet presence anymore. Without him, the house felt strangely hollow, despite being full of people. I walked into the dining room and immediately noticed something that made me stop. The table had been carefully arranged for 6 people. 5 chairs stood neatly grouped together. One chair sat several feet away, at the very end. Mine. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't accidental. Someone had deliberately placed it apart from everyone else. No one acknowledged it. No one looked embarrassed. I quietly pulled out the chair and sat down. Dinner began as though everything were perfectly normal. Emily described the honeymoon. David joked about married life. My mother complimented the wedding photographer. The conversation flowed around me without ever truly including me. Occasionally, someone asked whether I wanted more potatoes or another dinner roll, but no one asked how I had been. No one mentioned the wedding itself. It was as though they had silently agreed that my absence required no explanation. I answered politely whenever someone spoke to me. Mostly, I listened. Watching people often reveals far more than questioning them. Emily wore the engagement ring with obvious pride. Every time she lifted her wine glass, the diamond caught the light. She smiled often, completely comfortable with the life she believed she had secured. David carried himself with effortless confidence. Too much confidence. The kind possessed by people convinced they would never face consequences. Halfway through dinner, he leaned back in his chair and wrapped an arm casually around Emily. Then he looked directly at me. "You know," he said with a grin that instantly reminded me of our phone call, "it's nice finally having dinners that feel like real family gatherings." Silence settled over the table. He wasn't finished. "I mean," he shrugged theatrically, "everyone here actually belongs." The words landed exactly as he intended. I slowly set down my fork. Across the table, my mother focused intently on cutting her chicken. Emily stared into her plate. Not one person corrected him. Not one person said my name. Not one person objected. Their silence spoke louder than David ever could. I looked from face to face, searching for even the smallest sign of discomfort. There wasn't one. For years I had believed cruelty required raised voices or angry arguments. I finally understood that true cruelty often arrived wrapped in silence. The meal continued. Someone refilled glasses. Someone laughed at another story. The conversation simply moved forward, leaving David's words hanging in the air as though they had described nothing controversial at all. I finished my meal without another word. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. When dessert arrived, I quietly excused myself and stepped outside onto the back porch. The evening air felt cool against my face. The garden looked much smaller than I remembered. My father and I had spent countless weekends planting flowers together. Every spring we argued playfully over where new roses should go. Standing there alone, I could almost hear his voice explaining how healthy roots mattered far more than beautiful blossoms. The screen door opened behind me. Emily stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one toward me. "I thought you might want this." I accepted it without speaking. For a few moments we stood side by side watching the sunset. Then she sighed. "I think you're making all of this harder than it needs to be." I turned toward her. "What exactly is all of this?" She folded her arms. "You've always depended on Mom and Dad." I frowned. "I supported them." "No." She shook her head. "You built your entire life around them." Her voice carried none of the warmth I remembered from childhood. "You never got married." I remained silent. "You never had children." Another pause. "You never created a family of your own." Each sentence felt carefully prepared. "You stayed here while everyone else moved forward." I looked at her, searching desperately for some trace of the little girl who once begged me to read bedtime stories. She was gone. "So now," Emily continued evenly, "it's my turn." My turn? My turn to have support. My turn to build something. My turn to be first. I stared at her. "You think that's what this is about?" She didn't answer. Instead, my mother stepped onto the porch. She had clearly heard enough to join us. "Honey," she said gently, "Emily isn't trying to hurt you." I almost laughed. Then what is she trying to do? My mother sighed as though I were the unreasonable one. "You've always been strong, independent. You've managed just fine on your own." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So because I survived," she interrupted softly, "now it's time to help your sister." I felt my heartbeat slowing rather than quickening. A strange calm spread through me. "You've already had your opportunities," my mother continued. "Emily is just getting started." I finally understood. None of my sacrifices had ever been viewed as gifts. They had been expectations. Obligation. Resources to be redistributed whenever someone else wanted more. My years of hard work had not earned gratitude. They had simply established a pattern everyone expected to continue forever. I placed the untouched coffee mug on the porch railing. "I understand now," I said quietly. Emily gave a small nod, apparently believing I had finally accepted my place. She couldn't have been more mistaken. "I've heard everything I needed to hear." Without another word, I walked through the house toward the front door. No one followed me. No one tried to stop me. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The porch light grew smaller behind me until it disappeared completely. For the first time in my life, I stopped grieving the family I thought I had lost, because that family had never truly existed. And once I accepted that painful truth, I also realized something else. I no longer had anything left to protect, except the truth itself. As I pulled into my driveway that night, I realized something had changed inside me. I wasn't driving home as a rejected daughter anymore. I was driving home as someone who finally understood the truth. My family hadn't simply chosen Emily over me. They had spent years quietly building a future that depended on my sacrifices while convincing me it was love. If I wanted justice, emotion would never be enough. I needed proof. I barely slept. Before sunrise, I carried a mug of coffee into my bedroom and walked directly to the cedar chest sitting at the foot of my bed. My father had given it to me shortly before he passed away. "Keep the important things together," he had said with a smile. "One day you'll be glad you did." At the time, I assumed he was talking about family memories. Now I wondered if he had meant something much more practical. Dust drifted into the morning light as I lifted the heavy lid. Inside were old family photographs, handwritten Christmas cards, newspaper clippings, and carefully organized folders tied with faded ribbon. Every item carried a memory, but I forced myself to stay focused. I wasn't searching for nostalgia. I was searching for the truth. One folder immediately caught my attention because my father had written my name across the front in his unmistakable handwriting. I opened it carefully. The first document was a bank receipt. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but then my eyes settled on the amount. It was the exact mortgage payment I had made years earlier to save the family home. The receipt carried the bank's official stamp, the payment date, my account information, and my signature. I closed my eyes for a moment. For years, everyone had spoken as though the house had survived because the family somehow struggled through together. That wasn't true. The paper in my hands proved it. I had paid the debt. I had protected that house. Not because anyone demanded it, but because I believed my family was worth saving. I remembered standing inside the bank that afternoon years earlier with trembling hands as I handed the cashier a cashier's check representing nearly everything I owned. I remembered walking outside afterward feeling strangely relieved, instead of frightened because I truly believed we had survived together. My father had hugged me that evening. He rarely expressed emotion openly, but that night he had held my shoulders and quietly said, "You saved more than a house today." At the time I thought he meant our home. Now I wondered if he had been trying to tell me something else. Beneath the receipt lay another envelope. Unlike everything else inside the chest, this one had never been opened. Across the front my father had written only 2 words. "For Sarah." My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Several neatly folded pages rested inside. The moment I recognized my father's handwriting, tears blurred my vision. His words felt as though they had traveled through time. "My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, then circumstances have unfolded exactly as I feared they might. There are things I hoped would never need explaining, but hope alone cannot protect the people we love." I took a slow breath before continuing. He wrote about watching me quietly sacrifice opportunity after opportunity without complaint. He admitted he had worried I gave too much of yourself to people who might someday mistake generosity for obligation. Then I reached the sentence that changed everything. I have updated my will so the family home passes directly to you. I stopped reading. The room became completely silent. I read the sentence again. Then a third time. There could be no misunderstanding. My father had intentionally left the house to me. Further down the page, he explained why. He believed I understood the value of the home because I had fought to preserve it when everyone else had nearly given up. He wrote that ownership was never about money, it was about honoring responsibility. Near the bottom of the final page, one paragraph had been underlined. If anyone ever pressures you to surrender what is rightfully yours, remember that truth does not disappear simply because others deny it. Trust the law, trust the evidence. Most importantly, trust yourself. By the time I finished reading, tears rolled freely down my face. Not tears of grief. Not anymore. These were tears of relief. Someone had believed me. Someone had seen every sacrifice. Someone had quietly prepared a way to protect me, long after he was gone. I carefully folded the letter and placed it beside the mortgage receipt. Together they formed something stronger than memories. They formed evidence. As I continued sorting through the chest, another memory surfaced with remarkable clarity. I was 10 years old, kneeling beside my father in the backyard. We were planting a small rose bush together. I complained because digging through hard soil seemed impossible. He smiled, handed me the shovel again, and said, "Strong roots always take the longest to grow." When we finished planting, he brushed dirt from my hands. Flowers bloom because nobody sees the work happening underneath. Standing alone in my bedroom all those years later, I finally understood what he had been teaching me. Character is built quietly. So is truth. I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing every document into separate folders. The forged property transfer. The authentic mortgage receipt. My father's handwritten letter. Copies of the county records. Each page strengthened the foundation beneath my feet. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't reacting to what my family had done. I was preparing for what came next. By evening, I knew there was only one person I trusted to examine everything objectively: Harris Coleman. He had served as my father's attorney for decades and had become a close family friend long before I was born. As children, Emily and I used to joke that Harris knew more family secrets than anyone else in town because our father never made an important decision without consulting him first. If anyone could tell me whether these documents truly carried legal weight, it was Harris. The following morning I called his office. His longtime receptionist answered. When I introduced myself, she immediately recognized my voice. "Sarah," she said warmly. "It's been far too long. I need to see Mr. Coleman. Is everything all right?" I glanced at the folders spread across my dining table. "No," I answered honestly, "but I think it finally can be." She found an opening in his schedule for later that afternoon. As I gathered every document into a leather portfolio, I felt something I hadn't experienced since making that devastating phone call to my mother. It wasn't hope. Hope can still be disappointed. This was certainty. For days I had searched for proof that my family had betrayed me. Instead, I had discovered something far more powerful. My father had already anticipated that one day I might need to defend the truth, and he had quietly left me the first weapons I would need to win. Walking into Harris Coleman's office that afternoon, I realized I wasn't carrying a folder full of papers. I was carrying every unanswered question that had haunted me since the day my mother told me I wasn't real family. The receptionist greeted me kindly before leading me down a familiar hallway lined with shelves of legal books. I had walked these halls as a little girl beside my father, never imagining I would one day return seeking protection from the very people I once believed would always protect me. Harris stood as I entered. His hair had turned almost completely silver, but his steady eyes hadn't changed. He walked around his desk, shook my hand firmly, and looked at me with genuine concern. "Sarah," he said quietly, "you look like you've been carrying the world." "I think I've been carrying the wrong people." He motioned for me to sit. "I've brought something my father left for me." Without another word, I placed the mortgage receipt, the handwritten letter, copies of the property transfer, and the forged signature in front of him. Harris didn't interrupt, as I explained everything from beginning to end. I told him about the wedding, the missing invitation, the comments about real family, Nora's warning, the county records office, and the forged deed. Every sentence became easier once I started speaking. By the time I finished, the silence inside the room felt heavier than before. Harris removed his glasses and slowly rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I wish I could tell you this is the first time I've seen something like this," he said. "Unfortunately, it isn't." He reached for the property transfer first, studying every page carefully. "This signature isn't yours." "No, I didn't think so." He placed the document beside the genuine mortgage receipt. Forgery involving real estate is not simply unethical. It's a criminal offense. Whoever organized this believed they could move property without you ever questioning it. He then unfolded my father's letter. I watched his expression soften as he recognized the handwriting. "I remember the day your father updated his estate documents," Harris said quietly. My heart skipped. "You were there?" He nodded. "He specifically asked me to make certain the house would pass to you." I leaned forward. "Did he explain why?" "He said something I've never forgotten." Harris smiled sadly, before repeating my father's words, almost exactly. "Sarah has spent her entire adult life protecting this family. If anyone understands what this home truly represents, it's her." I lowered my eyes. "He knew?" "He knew far more than he ever admitted." Harris carefully folded the letter again. "Your father loved every member of this family, but he also worried that your generosity would eventually be mistaken for obligation. He admired your kindness. He feared people would exploit it." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I had spent weeks wondering whether anyone had truly seen what I had sacrificed. Now I knew my father had, even if he never said it aloud while he was alive. Harris opened a yellow legal pad. "Here's where we stand." He drew several lines across the page, organizing everything into separate columns. "First, we preserve every original document exactly as it is. Nothing leaves your possession unless absolutely necessary." I nodded. "Second, we obtain certified copies from the county records office through formal legal channels." Another note. "Third, we begin investigating everyone involved in that property transfer." "You think more than one person knew?" He looked up. "I'd be shocked if only one person did." His calm certainty was strangely reassuring. Instead of reacting emotionally, he treated every discovery like another piece of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Then his expression grew more serious. "Sarah, from this point forward, you cannot confront your family." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." He rested both hands on the desk. "People become unpredictable when they realize their lies are about to collapse. Let them believe you remain hurt and confused. Never let them know you're building a legal case." I understood immediately. Silence was no longer surrender. It was strategy. Over the following week, Harris worked quietly while I returned to teaching. Outwardly, my life looked completely ordinary. I graded papers, attended faculty meetings, and smiled politely whenever someone asked how I had been. Inside, however, I found myself checking my phone constantly, waiting for Harris to call. The call finally came late one Thursday afternoon. "I think you should come by." His voice carried an urgency I hadn't heard before. Less than an hour later, I sat across from him again. This time, a thin folder rested on his desk. "I requested financial records connected to several public filings," he explained. One detail led to another. He slid the folder toward me. Inside were banking documents connected to an account jointly held by Emily and David. At first, the numbers meant nothing. Then I noticed several deposits. They looked painfully familiar. I stared at one amount. Then another. Then another. Every figure matched transfers I had made over the years to help my parents. The exact amounts. The exact dates. My breathing slowed. They're your transfers." I looked at him in disbelief. "I sent those to my parents." "I know. So why are they?" He finished the sentence for me. "Ending up here?" I couldn't answer. He opened another page. It appears many of the payments you believed were covering household expenses were redirected shortly after arriving. My chest tightened. For how long? Harris pointed to the earliest transaction. Nearly 5 years. 5 years. 5 years of skipped vacations. 5 years of extra tutoring. 5 years of believing I was helping keep my parents financially secure. I turned another page. Large withdrawals appeared every few months. What was the money used for? Harris opened another file. I found records connected to David's construction business. He paused. It failed. I frowned. He never mentioned that. I doubt he wanted anyone to know. Harris tapped the documents. The business accumulated substantial losses. Loans came due. Payments had to be made. My eyes slowly returned to the account statements. The money I earned appears to have helped cover those losses. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly, every conversation with David took on an entirely different meaning. Every time he had spoken confidently about future investments, every boast about expanding his business, every expensive purchase I assumed he could afford, now looked different. He hadn't been building success. He had been surviving on money I believed was helping my parents. For years, I thought I had been supporting my family through difficult times. Instead, I had unknowingly financed someone else's failures. I closed the folder carefully. The betrayal no longer felt scattered across dozens of painful memories. For the first time, it had a clear pattern. And patterns are much harder to explain away than isolated mistakes. Once I recognized the pattern, I stopped believing in coincidences altogether. Every document Harris uncovered revealed another layer of deception, and every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. If my family had been willing to steal my money and forge my signature, I couldn't help wondering what else they had hidden behind carefully rehearsed smiles. Harris encouraged me to stay patient, but patience became increasingly difficult. One Saturday afternoon, my mother called unexpectedly. "I found a box of your father's books," she said. "They're taking up space in the attic. If you want them, come by this afternoon." The invitation sounded strangely casual. Too casual. Normally, I would have declined, but something inside me insisted I go. Before leaving, I slipped a small digital voice recorder into my purse. Harris hadn't told me to record anyone illegally or provoke a confrontation. He had simply reminded me of one thing. When people think they're safe, he had said, they often reveal more than they intend. The house felt strangely quiet when I arrived. My mother greeted me politely, directing me toward several cardboard boxes sitting near the kitchen doorway. "There they are," she said, "mostly old books and papers." Emily appeared a few minutes later, carrying groceries inside. She smiled stiffly before disappearing into the kitchen with my mother. Neither of them seemed particularly interested in me, which suited me perfectly. I spent several minutes sorting through the books, while quietly placing the recorder on a nearby shelf behind a decorative vase. Then I carried one of the boxes toward the front door. "I'm heading out," I called. My mother answered without leaving the kitchen. "Drive safely." I stepped outside, closed the front door gently, and waited. A full minute passed. Then another. I quietly re-entered through the side entrance, leading toward the laundry room, careful not to make unnecessary noise. Their voices drifted clearly from the kitchen. Emily sounded anxious. "What if she finds out?" Silence followed. Then my mother's voice answered. "Finds out what?" "You know exactly what." Another pause. "The night Dad died." My heart seemed to stop beating. I stood frozen. Emily spoke again, her voice lower this time. "What if Sarah starts asking questions about why we waited?" The kitchen fell silent long enough for me to hear the refrigerator humming. Finally, my mother spoke. "She won't." "How can you be sure?" "Because she never questions us." Emily didn't sound convinced. "Things are different now." "No," my mother replied firmly. "She's emotional. Hurt people don't think clearly. She'll eventually accept things the way she always has." I felt my hands begin to shake. Emily whispered something I almost missed. "What about the will?" My mother's answer came immediately. "The less anyone says about that night, the better." Neither woman spoke again for several moments. I quietly retrieved the recorder, walked back outside, and didn't stop until I reached my car. Only after locking the doors did I replay the recording. Hearing the conversation a second time felt even worse. The words themselves didn't prove a crime, but they proved something almost as disturbing. There were facts about my father's final hours that had been deliberately hidden from me. For years, I had accepted the official explanation without hesitation. My father had suffered a sudden heart attack. Everything happened too quickly. There had been nothing anyone could do. Now I wasn't so sure. Had someone delayed calling for help? Had an argument taken place before the ambulance arrived? Had my father tried to tell me something he never had the chance to finish? Questions crowded my mind faster than I could answer them. That evening, I drove directly to Harris's office. He listened carefully to the recording without interrupting. When it ended, he leaned back thoughtfully. "This doesn't prove criminal responsibility for your father's death," he said carefully. "I know, but it absolutely proves they are hiding something connected to that night." He wrote several notes before looking back at me. "We'll need to investigate further." I nodded. "I don't even know what I'm looking for anymore." "The truth." His answer came without hesitation. "And we follow evidence wherever it leads." Over the next several days, I found it nearly impossible to concentrate on anything except the investigation. Every ordinary task felt unreal. My students noticed I seemed distracted, and I blamed it on paperwork and end-of-term responsibilities. Then, just as I was leaving a grocery store one afternoon, I heard someone call my name. "Sarah." I turned. David stood leaning casually against my car. There was no smile this time, only confidence. "We should talk." "I don't think so." He stepped closer anyway. "I've heard you've been asking questions." "I ask lots of questions." "Stop asking these." His tone remained calm, but his eyes carried something colder. "You're making things complicated for everyone." I wasn't aware the truth was complicated. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "You've been digging into property records." I said nothing. "You've spoken to lawyers." Again, I remained silent. His expression hardened. "You really need to let this go." "And if I don't?" He moved close enough that only I could hear him. "Then people are going to start wondering about you." I looked directly at him. "What does that mean?" He shrugged. "You live alone." "So? You don't have a husband." I continued staring at him. "No children." He smiled thinly. "It wouldn't be difficult to convince people you've become unstable." The words settled heavily between us. Suddenly, the strange kindness my mother had shown recently made sense. The careful invitations, the unusually gentle phone calls. They weren't trying to repair our relationship. They were preparing a different story. David leaned even closer. "Nobody believes the lonely relative who suddenly accuses her whole family." For a moment, I simply watched him. Then, perhaps because he mistook my silence for fear, he became careless. "I've invested 5 years making sure that house becomes ours." The sentence escaped before he could stop himself. His eyes widened slightly. He realized what he had admitted. Before either of us spoke again, another shopper pushing a cart slowed nearby. "Everything all right over here?" David immediately stepped backward, smiling as though we were discussing weekend plans. "Everything's fine." The man looked uncertain but eventually continued walking. David adjusted his jacket. "You should think carefully about your next move." Then he walked away. I remained beside my car for several moments, replaying every word in my mind. Only then did I notice the security cameras mounted high above the parking lot. Their lenses pointed directly toward the row where we had been standing. David believed he had frightened me into silence. Instead, he had unknowingly given me another reason to believe that the truth was finally beginning to expose itself. Watching David disappear across the parking lot, I realized fear had changed sides. He thought his threats would send me running, but they had accomplished the opposite. Every careless word, every attempt to intimidate me, only confirmed that Harris had been right from the beginning. People with nothing to hide don't panic when someone starts asking questions. They certainly don't threaten to destroy another person's reputation to protect themselves. The very next morning, I called Harris and told him everything that had happened in the parking lot. He listened carefully before asking only one question. Were there security cameras? I noticed them after he walked away. A quiet smile crossed his face. Good. We'll request the footage before it's overwritten. Within days, formal requests were submitted through the proper legal channels. While we waited, Harris advised me to make one important change. No more financial support. I stared at him. I've been helping my parents every month for years. I know. If I stop, they'll notice immediately. Exactly. It felt cruel. Not because they deserved my help anymore, but because generosity had become such a deeply rooted habit that withholding it felt unnatural. Still, Harris reminded me that every payment only strengthened the illusion that I accepted the role they had assigned me. So, for the first time in years, I transferred nothing. A week passed, then another. My phone remained silent, until one Tuesday evening. My mother called. Her voice sounded unusually warm. Hi, sweetheart. I couldn't remember the last time she had used that word. Hello. Everything all right? I'm fine. There was a brief hesitation. We were just wondering. Another pause. Did you forget to send the mortgage money this month? There it was. Not concern. Not an apology. Money. I looked out my kitchen window before answering. I assumed you didn't need my help anymore. What do you mean? I thought I wasn't part of the family. Silence. A long silence. Then my mother laughed awkwardly. Oh, don't be dramatic. I'm not. You know we didn't mean. I interrupted gently. No, I know exactly what you meant. She quickly changed the subject before ending the call a few minutes later. The next day, Emily called. Then David. Then my mother again. Each conversation revolved around finances disguised as concern. Not one of them asked how I was healing. Not one of them apologized for the wedding. They simply needed the money to return. Harris wasn't surprised. They're feeling pressure. What kind? If the mortgage is becoming difficult again, that means whatever financial structure they've built isn't as stable as they pretended. A few days later, another surprise arrived. A thick envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside were legal documents notifying me that Emily and David had petitioned the court to appoint a guardian to oversee my financial affairs. I read the first page twice before understanding what it actually meant. They were attempting to convince a judge that I was mentally incapable of managing my own life. According to the petition, my recent behavior demonstrated paranoia, irrational accusations against family members, emotional instability, and poor financial judgment. Several printed text messages were attached as supporting evidence. At first glance, they appeared to be conversations between my mother and me. Except I had never written them. The dates were inconsistent. One message, supposedly sent at 9:14 p.m., referred to a phone call that records proved happened after 10 o'clock that same evening. Another contained language I had never used. The mistakes were subtle. Most people would never notice them. But I knew my own conversations. They forged these too, I whispered. Harris examined every page. They're becoming desperate. What happens now? We respond. He immediately arranged meetings with handwriting experts, digital forensic specialists, and my bank. Every legitimate record of my financial history showed years of responsible budgeting, stable employment, mortgage payments made on time, and charitable donations. Nothing resembled the reckless instability described in their petition. Even so, Harris warned me not to underestimate them. Once someone begins manufacturing evidence, they rarely stop with one attempt. His prediction proved accurate. 2 weeks later, I received notice that I would undergo an independent psychological evaluation requested by the opposing side. The examining psychologist had been selected through recommendations provided by Emily's attorney. Harris raised an eyebrow. Interesting. You think they'll try something? I think they'll hope you become emotional enough to support their narrative. The morning of the appointment, I dressed as I would for a normal day of teaching. Professional. Calm. Prepared. Before leaving home, I quietly activated the voice recorder inside my purse. The evaluation lasted nearly 2 hours. At first, The psychologist asked ordinary questions about my childhood, career, and daily routine. Then the conversation shifted. He repeatedly returned to my family. Do you believe your relatives are conspiring against you? I believe I have evidence they committed fraud. Does anyone else believe these things? My attorney. He wrote something. Minutes later, he asked almost the same question differently. If several family members disagree with you, could your interpretation be mistaken? I trust documents more than opinions. Again, he wrote notes. I answered every question carefully, without raising my voice. Toward the end of the interview, he sighed and leaned back. You seem remarkably composed. I've had a lot of practice. For the first time, he smiled. Then, perhaps forgetting the recorder quietly capturing every word, he spoke more candidly than he should have. I'll admit, this isn't exactly the assessment I expected after reading what your family submitted. My heartbeat quickened. What were you expecting? He shrugged. They presented someone emotionally unstable, confused, and unable to separate reality from suspicion. And instead, he looked directly at me. You've answered consistently, provided documentation for every significant claim, and demonstrated excellent insight. He paused before adding almost absent-mindedly. Frankly, I'm not sure why they believed this evaluation would support their position. I thanked him politely and left without revealing what I had recorded. Back in Harris's office later that afternoon, we listened to the conversation together. He smiled for the first time in weeks. They've made another mistake. What do you mean? They assumed truth could be manufactured. He closed the recorder carefully. But the more they fabricate, the more opportunities they give us to expose them. As I gathered the growing stack of evidence spread across his conference table, I realized the courtroom was no longer a possibility waiting somewhere in the future. It was becoming inevitable. And this time, I would walk into it carrying far more than painful memories. I would walk in carrying the truth. As I reflect on Sarah's journey, I believe this story is not really about a house, an inheritance, or even revenge. It is about the painful moment when we realize that love without respect eventually becomes sacrifice without limits. Many good people spend years believing that giving more will finally earn appreciation, but true love should never require you to erase yourself to make someone else comfortable. Kindness is a beautiful quality, but kindness without healthy boundaries can invite people to take advantage of your generosity. If there is one lesson I hope you take away from this story, it is that you should never confuse guilt with responsibility, and you should never allow anyone, even family, to convince you that your value depends on what you can provide. Protect your dignity as carefully as you protect the people you love. Keep important records, understand your legal rights, and never ignore the small warning signs simply because they come from those closest to you. Forgiveness is a personal choice, but trust should always be earned through honesty and respect. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone who needs encouragement, I hope it inspires you to value yourself, speak the truth with courage, and remember that the strongest victories are not built on hatred, but on justice, wisdom, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you never betrayed your own principles.